Where do the world's top data scientists and machine learning engineers think AI is really heading? How can you join them and break into your own data science, machine learning, or data analytics career? Those questions are what we're all about. My name's Jeremy, and welcome to the Mind the Machines podcast.
No matter what institution you're coming from, you can get access to the very latest research.
We also have to make sure that we're constantly revisiting our foundations and justifying why we're using the methods we are.
It's hard not to employ you. It doesn't matter what field you're in or what is it that you're good at. If you're good at something, if you like something with passion, there is someone who really needs you.
So David Duvenaud is an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, where his research work's focused on machine learning, deep learning, and most recently one thing that we'll have to unpack a little bit called neural ODEs. His academic and industry careers have included stints at Harvard, Cambridge, and Google Research, and he's also founded an energy forecasting and trading firm called Invenia. And that was a lot to get through, and it only scratches the surface, which is why it's a good thing that we have him here now. David, thanks for hopping on.
Oh, thank you very much.
Well, so David, you're at the cutting edge of ML and deep learning. You've even invented some fairly radically new architectures and algorithms. What is it that made you dive into the field in the first place, especially given that there wasn't all the hype around it at the time that there is today?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, I had been interested in artificial intelligence since as long as I can remember, and I started programming with my friends when I was about 12, like in QBasic, and had a blast with it. But the things that I really remember changing my view were, one, talking to some cool guys on LiveJournal back in like 2001 or so, who were talking about these things, including Shane Legg back then, who's now the co-founder of DeepMind. So he had an interesting blog about being a PhD student with Marcus Hooter at IDSIA and working on sort of the foundations of superintelligence. And then the other thing that I really remember is finding Jürgen Schmidhuber's webpage in around, like 2002 or something, when I was still an undergrad. And this was like totally mind-blowing. I mean, so he has a lot of essays that are like a little bit out there, but they're talking about how things like humor or beauty or surprise could be expressed in terms of information theory and prediction and things like this. And so this sort of what looked like to me to be dry, mathy subjects were suddenly connected to these more like humane and interesting elements. Also, actually, one other way I got started was seeing the work of Carl Sims, who had done a bunch of work in the 80s, I think, and early 90s on sort of evolutionary algorithms, which now I think is a terrible optimization algorithm, but it was sort of the first thing that people really looked at, and he had all these amazing demos of like creatures learning simple motor policies to like swim or walk or things like this. So
it sounds like you're describing an emotional reaction that happens when you first viscerally understand that, oh, actually, all of the feelings that I have, like the firings of my limbic system and the things that I really deeply care about, can be deconstructed into math.
Yeah, and also sort of meeting math halfway to realize that it's not just an arbitrary abstract system, but it just is what happens when we try to formalize anything. And we're not necessarily always losing that much by trying to formalize it.
And so you caught the bug, is it fair to say, straight out of undergrad? There was no graduate education required?
Oh, yeah. And actually, now that I think about it, one other thing is I remember reading this book on artificial life, and there was like these communities of people making these little demos where you would have some little creatures that interacted in some like simple simulation. And I mean, it doesn't really have anything to do with life, but it was kind of really encouraging how much interesting behavior you could get out of just running some simple rules, like cellular automata and that sort of thing, and having them, just display all these emergent behaviors. And I think this is sort of like well understood now, and it's not as exciting as it used to be, but it was sort of a proof of concept that it's sort of easy to make a ghost in the machine if you just sort of play around with these elements.
And has the field in general evolved faster or less fast than you expected it to evolve at this point? Because I mean, you're mentioning all these rule-based systems and how impressive they seemed back then. Obviously, things have been revolutionized now since the advent of deep learning, RL. Are things has the promise of machine learning been paid out in full at this point, do you think?
Oh, I mean, certainly not in full. It's really funny because there's always new people coming into the field, and they are aware of some aspects and some tools and some foundational ideas and not aware of some other ones. So a great example to me is the hype on evolutionary strategies recently. which is basically just sort of random local search. I mean, it really is just that. And it's an old algorithm. I think it has like very unsophisticated exploration and extrapolation strategies. And it only worked because of scaling it up. And that, to be fair, that's what the initial papers were about, saying, oh, this is a scalable algorithm. But it was kind of how many people got excited, and sort of became apparent to me that people didn't realize how great, for instance, like gradients are for optimization in high dimensions. And like sort of there was this feeling that, oh, maybe we should just go back to these like older, simpler algorithms. I mean, I also constantly get emails from students who their advisor taught them about like fuzzy logic, for instance. And in my mind, fuzzy logic is like a completely obsolete, underspecified, poor man's bastardization of just probabilistic reasoning. And so there's no reason why we should ever talk about it anymore. It's kind of like if we had like Roman numerals versus Arabic numerals. Like it's just, we're done, we moved on. There's no need to ever talk about the old way again as a serious tool. So even though the sort of people who, or the cutting edge is moving along, there's still always this long tail of people who are just getting into the field and enter it in these like funny sort of, I would say, obsolete alleys. And so we also have to make sure that we're constantly revisiting our foundations and justifying why we're using the methods we are using. So it's kind of healthy that we have this diversity of opinion, but it's also kind of funny to watch people reinventing stuff that I think is basically obsolete the day it's published.
Well, on that note, and not to defend fuzzy logic at all here, but what about you look at evolutionary strategies and how that's being taken seriously now in light of fairly recent, I guess it was about 2 years ago, OpenAI first really pushed that forward as maybe a way of achieving state-of-the-art results. How often do you see that happening? I mean, do you really think we can park some of these models away forever?
Okay, so I guess I will say there's a big virtue to simplicity. So in some situations, it will make sense to do something like evolutionary strategies. But one thing, okay, so if you look into the math of evolution strategies, an alternate way to view it is that at every iteration, it evaluates your function at a whole bunch of points, does not get any gradient information. And the math isn't expressed this way, but it's equivalent to fitting a linear regression to the points that you've observed. So kind of like saying that I have like this surrogate function that I'm going to fit to my observations, then taking one step of steepest descent in that direction, adding some noise, and then starting again. And so any one part of this system can be improved. Like for instance, we could fit a nonlinear surrogate. We could not throw away all the data at each step. We could use a more sophisticated exploration strategy than adding random noise. And the scaling properties of the algorithm would still be maintained. So that's one thing I think that's not obvious in that paper. They say, we should use this algorithm because it scales. You can run each of the queries independently and combine it. You can do that for like a whole wide class of interesting algorithms. And all you really need is this sort of like scatter gather operation. So so the point is, we really think we can do better in a lot of ways that are really straightforward than evolution strategies. And so its only benefit really is simplicity. So that's what I'll say about that.
Well, the future in this, just like everything, I guess, isn't evenly distributed. So it's true for sure. Like there are things like evolutionary strategies that may be the right tool for the right thing, and then things like fuzzy logic that, I mean, as a consummate Bayesian myself, I could not agree with you more about fuzzy logic. It's particularly striking if you start out studying probability theory and then you get a dose of fuzzy logic and you're like, what is this?
Actually, can we just unpack that for a second for folks who might not necessarily know what fuzzy logic is, partly because it is sort of dated? David, would you mind kind of unpacking what that is?
Sure. And I'm sad, but okay. So the basic idea is that when people, so one thing I want to say is that it was only relatively recently that probability became the dominant paradigm for representing uncertainty. So for instance, one of the main machine learning conferences, at least until recently, was uncertainty in AI. And as far as I remember, I might be getting details wrong. This grew out of, I think, triple AI. And there was a poll, I think, I'm trying to remember the years. It was something like in the 1980s, someone said, who here thinks that probability is important for representing uncertainty? And there was like some very small minority that raised their hands. And there were all these competing ideas of like Dempster-Schaeffer theory and again, like also fuzzy logic. So it wasn't obvious to AI practitioners at the time that probability really could do everything that we thought it could. I think that the theory had been done long, like in the 60s, that actually showed this, but for whatever reason, it wasn't obvious to the people who were working at the time. So I think as recently as the 80s, at least certainly when I took AI in undergrad, we learned about these different notions of uncertainty. So I want to say it's not obvious. Like I'm totally dunking on all these other methods, but that's as an expert talking to other experts who have spent their adult lives thinking hard about this problem. I think it's not obvious to someone who hasn't spent a lot of time thinking about it that probability really can do everything that you want it to do. And I want to make a shout out to E.T. Jaynes. He has this amazing book called Probability Theory, The Logic of Science, that really, in a surprisingly readable way, lays out the case in this sort of like unambiguous like train of like argument that you realize there's just nothing else that you could ever really want to use. Okay, so to answer your original question though, fuzzy logic basically says, the way I've always seen it motivated is that we might have this idea of like tall and short people. And we don't want to draw a hard line between whether someone's tall or short. We can say someone is like short to some degree and tall to some degree. So we're going to have some real number between 0 and 1 that represents their measurement, or their membership rather, of being in the short set or the tall set. And then the question is like, what if I get some evidence that someone is shorter than I thought they were? Then I have to somehow increase the short number and decrease the tall number. And then there's a whole set of rules that people propose for combining these numbers, like taking the max of them or something like that. You can do whatever you want at this point, and you can argue for different ways of combining. I'm not really clear what these numbers mean anymore, and the method is sort of underspecified. That's my vague understanding of fuzzy logic as it was taught to me. I mean, and to be fair, like even in a frequentist paradigm, it's not really clear how to define probabilities in a non-circular way. And I'm getting this from David Mackay, right, where they say that probability is the expectation that if you ran a lot of experiments, that you would see these results, like some particular result with high probability. So I would say like getting the foundations right is clearly not an easy task, but I do think that the foundations have been satisfactorily worked out.
Because we're talking a little bit about Jaynes here, how about just very briefly getting to unpack the frequentist versus Bayesian argument? Because this is something that I think a lot of people hear about it. They don't necessarily know what's involved, what the whole debate's about. So do you have like maybe a quick primer on what that whole debate is about?
The idea, the difference is that Bayesians treat probabilities as states of knowledge. And they say, if I knew this thing, then I would be this certain about this other quantity. And I can use the tools of probabilities and random variables to describe the optimal way for me to condition on new evidence. And like everyone believes in Bayes' rule, it's just like a simple identity. But the question is how you interpret probabilities. So my pet peeve, and I've seen lots of people make this weird statement when they try to answer this question of what is the difference between Bayesian and frequentist. They say a frequentist thinks that the truth is fixed but unknown, and a Bayesian thinks that the true value is a random variable. And this drives me absolutely up the wall. And I've seen professors at Harvard say this to their undergrad classes, and this was taught to me by my stats teacher. And the weird thing is that the Bayesians also think that the truth is fixed but unknown. Random variables to represent their uncertainty. So that's sort of like the foundational philosophical difference. There's also a bunch of operational differences, which is that the frequentists, the questions that they usually ask are about making guarantees about an estimator or some decision procedure. And they say, if I were to combine evidence or estimate something in this way, what could I prove about this procedure in the worst case? And I think that's like a very valid question. And I think if we could answer it for procedures that were powerful, that's a sort of a more interesting question to answer. I would love to have methods that I could say things about their worst case performance over all possible worlds. That would be I think the right question to ask. So I really have to get that under the.
Sorry, could you give a concrete example there, just so people have something to lock onto?
Sure. So a frequentist might want I might say, I'm going to run a randomized controlled trial, and I'm going to use this procedure to decide whether the drug is safe or not. And they would want to know, does my procedure only sort of approve drugs that are safe with some high probability, no matter what the underlying state of the world is with the drugs or human physiology or anything we might have to deal with?
Okay, so I can say that a drug has probability less than this of being dangerous if I given that I prove it.
Exactly. And no matter what the drug is or no matter what the sort of problem we're dealing with is, that would be a really good, strong guarantee to have. And then the problem comes in that usually the methods for which we can prove these sorts of bounds end up being really simple or somehow suboptimal most of the time. So when we try to train a really powerful, interesting model, we often have to give up those guarantees. So one really weird thing that's happened is that machine learning only became a thing in computer science for the most part. when really statisticians are the ones who should have invented all of the modern techniques, right? It's their backyard. And I think the reason that they didn't is that they were really, out of a sense of wanting to be responsible and only make claims that they could back up, stuck mostly to methods that they could prove things about, which ended up being basically like log linear models. And like
statisticians also they don't necessarily know how to write huge computer programs by default. And like to make a really powerful model of the kinds that we have nowadays actually requires you to know something about computer science.
So that's a great point, that the statisticians maybe don't know computer science, but you could say the same thing about computer scientists, that they don't know
statistics.
I do really appreciate the aesthetic point, though, that there's a sort of a cautiousness, because I remember coming from a physics background myself, where I did a lot of metrology, I did a lot of measurement theory and all this stuff. You get used to the idea that you can come up with a perfect, rigorous result every time, that you use Bayes' theorem over and over and over again, and you know that your result is going to be rigorously correct. And then all of a sudden you have some jackass who comes in and says, oh yeah, we'll just have a bunch of parameters and then backprop's going to take care of that. And then they'll magically end up giving you good, there's something really dirty and messy about that aesthetically just makes me viscerally uncomfortable. And you kind of have to get used to it.
Yeah, exactly. And so I totally share your guys' disgust with these sloppy methods. And I also came from my PhD was in Bayesian non-parametrics, where we also, again, had this like much more principled foundation. And, we could always make these statements about when our methods would work and why and how everything was going to automatically, integrate out. So it did feel a little bit like selling out to move into like deep learning. But before I get back to that, so the thing is, so the statisticians, I think, rightly wanted to maybe only use these methods that they could say something about for important decisions with like regards to like public health or things like this, right? But at some point, you spend a lot of time using methods that are so simple that you know that they're going to give the wrong answer most of the time, but at least you can say that you understand their wrongness. And at some point, it becomes worth it to switch over to this sloppy but very powerful model, and to ask the question: if I didn't have to make any guarantees, how powerful could I make my model? So maybe, and then at some point, like that's just a question you have to ask. So I mean, maybe a good example would be if you're trying to decide like who is safe to put on a roller coaster, you can just have it like you must be this tall to ride, and you can really understand that decision boundary pretty well, but. You can actually also write down a whole bunch of cases under which it's going to fail. So you can also just let people use their judgment, and then that's also going to fail invisibly in a lot of ways, but at least it has a chance to really look at reality in a detailed way.
But there's something about humans where we're more afraid of overfitting than underfitting, and I think that sort of that kind of, at least at the level of statistics is almost by definition underfitting all the time, because it tends.
I might argue that a little and say we're like almost like facile. We're afraid of anything that we don't necessarily understand. Like anything that, if we have a decision surface that's so complicated, that's just like, hey, like, a modern deep learning model, for example, how does it interpret a cat versus a dog? Like, I mean, really, we can put some interpretability tools on top of it and get a sense of what it's looking at, what it's focusing its attention on, blah, blah, blah. But really, there's no way for me to explain what this thing is thinking. And even when I explain my own judgment of what is a cat and what is a dog, I'm probably not including every factor that I'm taking into account. I'm probably just misinterpreting my own perceptions. Like, we fool ourselves into thinking that we can explain our reasoning to one another, but I mean, there is absolutely no evidence that the average person or even a very thoughtful person is able to do that accurately.
I totally agree. But I want to come back to Jeremy's point about we're more scared of overfitting than underfitting. I totally agree. And this might sound reasonable, because if you only underfit, you're never going to do something crazy, right? Like if you just do the same thing that worked before, or don't try to extrapolate too strongly, that does sound safe in a lot of settings. And this is sort of like the precautionary principle, which says, well, if we don't know what's going to happen, we shouldn't try it. But I think this really breaks down as soon as we have to make any decision problem, and as soon as there's any opportunity for gain or growth, right? And then the precautionary principle basically says, don't try this new drug, don't try this new therapy, don't try this intervention. And the problem comes when you really actually have to take one action or another, and just not doing anything isn't a valid option.
And I guess the more complex your decision landscape looks, the more options you have, the more damaging this underfitting can be. I mean, when we're looking at even right now, like what do we do in light of where artificial intelligence is going, what societal transformations we have in store? Like there are presumably a very small set of very specific decisions that we might be able to make to get out the other end safe and sound. And if we kind of sit back and say, oh no, we're going to underfit here because we know that the model of the 20th century worked, let's just keep applying that and stick to our guns. Like this is sort of just another way of running into the same problem.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I guess in general, I don't think we can say much in general about this, except that I think there's no way around actually rolling up our sleeves and trying to model the world in detail.
Mm-hmm. So you alluded to this kind of distinction between statisticians and computer, well, I was going to say computer programmers to use a kind of weird term for it, but computer scientists. So how did you yourself come to decide, like, okay, so I've got this great rigorous background. Now it's time to really like compromise my almost moral mathematical integrity and start to build dirty models that just work?
Yeah, well, first of all, I want to say I never felt like I had a strong math background or like a principled math background. And, so my undergrad was in computer science, and I wasn't particularly like good mathematician or anything.
You didn't have any math principles to betray then?
Yeah. And actually, when I went back to grad school, I was opened up Bishop's book on pattern recognition, like before the term started. And I think I'm going to, bone up on what I forgot over the last 2 years being in industry. And I wanted to do the first question of the first chapter. And I couldn't do it. It was basic matrix calculus, like the derivative with respect to a matrix and stuff. And I forgot everything, and I felt really crappy. And so I opened up my calculus textbook from undergrad, and I went to the multivariate calculus textbook, and I thought, okay, I'll just do the first question in this chapter, and I couldn't do it. So humiliated, I opened up the first page of the first chapter and just started like relearning calculus. And when I got into Cambridge, I also felt like, oh shit, I like faked my way in here somehow. But as long as I just like don't say anything out loud for like a year, they can't kick me out, and then it'll be too late.
And then you don't realize that every grad student feels the same way around you, more or less.
Yeah, but I think they did have a lot stronger math background. But then I kind of realized, well, but no one's like timing me. I can just spend like half a day doing like some trivial derivation. And so giving myself permission to be bad at math and start from where I was like totally a key step in all this working. And so anyway, the point is I'm still not good at math, but I'm not scared of it anymore.
For people who are trying to break in, because we talk a lot to folks who work in industry, and that's a big focus of the conversations that we have here, where in that case they're in a position to advise people on how to break into industry machine learning. You're in an interesting position where you're kind of straddling the line. You've done some industry work, some academic work. It's all been research. What are kind of the core competencies that you would emphasize for someone who wants to replicate your career trajectory?
Yeah, so I feel like I just learned math by seeing the same math over and over and over again. I've been talking to some of the graphics profs here at U of T, and they say, well, all of graphics is basically just integration by parts and the chain rule. And the hilarious thing is that like all of machine or deep learning at least is just the chain rule. So it's not like trivial, but it's always the same sort of things over and over again. You have these like continuous variables, these densities, these transformations, and derivatives. So I guess I would say don't be afraid if it takes a long time, because like the same core tools will serve you in so many different contexts that it's worth spending time. One nice thing about deep learning is I think it made the models actually simpler conceptually in some places, because if you read papers from like 10 years ago, oftentimes there's going to be one core contribution where they needed to make the model the way they did. And then there's a lot of hand engineering of features and ways of like specifying information flow that today we would just say, oh, and this part is a neural network. This is the feature extractor, or this is the thing that estimates this other distribution. And so suddenly, I learned all these complicated graphical models in grad school, but now all the graphical models that we see in a paper is basically there's just like one latent Z going to one X, and then like a neural network between them. That's like 90% of everything. So I do think it's actually conceptually made things a lot nicer, just allowing ourselves the freedom to say, this part is going to be a neural network that we're going to learn, and not to think too hard about it.
Sort of abstracts away the feature engineering component. Yeah. So in this journey, this sort of dualism between the computer science side and the stat side, which have you found more challenging to pick up on?
I guess I feel like conceptually stats has more to offer. It's like just, as we're talking about, reading E.T. James was like such a formative idea, like that knowledge is like has rules, and it makes sense, and we can talk about the optimal way to combine evidence, and maybe we can't compute it, but just knowing that there is an optimal, it's like, okay, if this was in physics, Bayes' theorem would be considered like the grand unified theory, and it would be this like amazing holy grail, right? Like when we do find like whatever like theory of everything, we're still not going to be able to compute it exactly for anything but like toy systems. But it would be considered this like amazing achievement that would let us understand everything in principle. And we sort of already have that in just cognitive science, like statistics, everything. It's already worked out. And now you could view this whole, all we're doing now is just trying to find approximations to Bayes' rule. That's sort of it.
It's also sort of interesting philosophically because you talked about, if this had come up in physics. And I guess what's funny to me is the day that somebody comes up with a grand unified theory of everything in physics, that itself will really just be one special case of applying Bayes' theorem. I mean, ultimately, physics itself is contained within this giant body of, like, we can only know anything in physics to the extent that we know it through Bayes' rule, even if we're not aware of having applied it explicitly.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Yeah.
It's a bit of a cheap philosophical point because it's sort of the ultimate trump card there, but
yeah.
One of the things that got me from physics to machine learning is that I used to think that physics was the most general thing, but then realized that intelligence was more general than physics. Because you can derive physics from intelligence, therefore it must be more general.
Yeah, and who was it who said that they like statistics because it lets you play in everyone's backyard? It was like Tukey or someone like that. And yeah, it's kind of like what you're saying. I mean, so this is already true of physics to some degree, but yeah, it's like sort of even more true of something like machine learning or stats.
Last quick question on the career side, just because that is a bit of a focus for some of the folks who we talk to. In terms of the skills, core competencies of people who try to move into, say, an academic research role, what are the things that you find are missing the most often when you have like an aspiring, say, professor or like a PhD student or master's student?
That's a great question. So yeah, so obviously there's the technical skills, like people might not know enough math, or they might just not know how to code at all. But I'd say the things that are missing are sort of like metacognitive skills. So, okay, so one of them is just being able to roughly estimate your state of knowledge in any field. If you can do that well, you can pretty much talk intelligently to anyone about anything and just saying, I don't know a lot as you go, right? And so when I see students who can write a research statement that makes it clear which parts that they know about and which parts they don't, then I'm already interested. And then the other part that's really like further on, like in terms of like professors or whatever, I would say like taste is something that is pretty important. So here's something that my advisor Carl Restoration said to me at the end of my PhD is that there's a million people out there who have the same technical skills or the technical skills to do good research if they knew what problem to choose. And once we've identified the problem, it is a little bit of just turning the crank to decide what experiments to run them, debug it, make figures, write it up, whatever. So almost the entire skill of doing good research is deciding what question to work on. So the problem with taste is that two people can just disagree and it's not clear, whose taste is better. But I think it's like anything, it's a skill that can be learned. And you can ask yourself, if you had been more interested in this other area, how would have things turned out differently? Because you get to see that because now you can like look at the people who did go, like if you ask yourself that question about yourself 3 years ago, you can look at the research that's been published in those areas since then, or your own area, and then see, oh, it would have actually been more fruitful if I had realized the potential of these areas. So the first 2 years of my PhD, we're working mainly on this idea of Bayesian Monte Carlo. I think after about 6 months, it should have been clear to me that this was not a good road to go down. And I started ignoring all these little red flags that say, well, all my examples where this works are really toy. And I have to ignore the fact that there's like gradient information available usually, which is like a very powerful thing that other methods do take advantage of that we don't know how to. And so that was like a super formative experience to have basically wasted 2 years by having bad taste and being overly philosophical and being driven by like what the ideal thing should be. And I'm so glad. At the time, I felt a little bit neglected by my advisor. But I think if he had just given me a bunch of well thought out ideas that were going to work for sure, I would have spent my postdoc and if I got a job, the first few years of my job, just chasing down these ideas that were never going to be fruitful. And I do see other people going down this road and publishing papers, and it's like your thing doesn't really work. I'm not going to use it because it's more principled, but it's not more useful. So anyway, I just want to say, taste is something you can learn. You can think hard about it, and it's sort of the most important skill that a researcher needs.
Telling whether something's a bad idea is definitely a muscle. And it's a muscle in a lot of different fields. I mean, it's a muscle, I've noticed it in startups. Like you can actually meet people who are better than other people at telling, is this a good startup idea or not?
And who didn't necessarily used to be.
And who didn't used to be. You can develop that faculty in academic ideas and in company ideas.
And so from a big picture standpoint, in terms of where the field's going, a lot of talk obviously about AGI and like of what OpenAI has just put out with their GPT-2 paper. What are your thoughts? This is the perennial, totally unfair question, but what are your thoughts about when AGI is going to hit, if it's going to hit? And actually, let's start with those questions because they're big enough to unpack.
Yeah, so that's a tough one, and I'm scared to give actual numbers. But let me say my 90% confidence interval is something like, let's say 15 years to 80 years from now. Having not really spent that much time thinking seriously through this, and there's people at, for instance, like the Future of Humanity Institute who have spent the last 3 or 4 years thinking seriously about this exact question. So they're the ones you should really ask. But I will say that I take this stuff seriously enough that Eric Langlois, who's an extremely strong student, who is working sort of full-time on these sort of questions, like how are things going to play out in the long run? Is there anything we can say about more powerful systems than we have today? Like how do we think they'll behave? How do we think we can tell whether they are going to act according to how we ask them to act? Stuff like that. So this is like AI safety. It's sort of like a very small, weird subdiscipline right now, but that's sort of my token effort to address these problems is to have one of my 6 or 7 grad students thinking about this full time. And it's really hard. And he's really the brave one here, right? I'm just spending a small amount of my resources on this question. He's dedicating his entire PhD, and who knows how much of his life to this question.
It's almost the definition of a hard question. Like, how do you put bounds on the behavior of something that is definitionally smarter than you are by orders of magnitude?
Yeah. So I agree. There is one reason for optimism, though, which is that there's a little bit of work recently making the point that it might be harder to lie than to tell the truth in general. So if you think about the way that a police interrogation works, it's not like the police have to figure out what the person did ahead of time and then somehow find the right evidence or trick them. They just have to ask them to tell a more and more detailed story about whatever they did that night. And if the person is lying, it's just really hard to do that in a consistent way. So we can imagine this even with maybe potentially an AI that's a little bit smarter than us. We can say, if we can access its brain, we can say, wait, why did you think that thought just then? And maybe it can give us some obfuscated answer, but the hope is that we can make it arbitrarily hard for it to give a consistent story if it's lying. So there's maybe a sort of truth teller's advantage here that will work in our favor. Who knows? I think it's very hard to say anything about this, and I think it's hard to say whether we'll ever make much progress in this direction before it's too late.
And what are the ethical issues that keep you up at night when you think about ML generally?
Yeah, well, more I think what the heck am I going to tell my daughter to study in undergrad, right? She's 4 months old now, right? So who knows if there will even be normal universities 18 years from now or whatever. But not just in terms of automation, but just in terms of the economy and civilization getting more efficient means that just like any efficient market, you can't really guess what's going to be a great career unless you're really already special to begin with. So I don't know, that kind of makes me a little bit anxious. I'm okay, haha, I got into a field that became hot after I got into it. I got really lucky. But that's just not a bit of advice you can give people, right? You just have to figure out the next hot thing and then get into it on the ground floor. So I'm anxious on other people's behalf about that, I guess.
It's hard. The faster the world changes, the more that becomes true. Because it's what the nenext hot thing, you might have a shorter time span, or because knowledge grows fractally, you might instead have subfields of this hot thing that are still hot and others that go cold. What do you do, especially if people are starting a PhD and a 5-year commitment, are you aiming yourself in a direction that after you come out the other end in 5 years is still going to be something valuable? It's not clear.
Yeah, although I will say a PhD student is, I think, uniquely flexible in how they spend their time. And if, as I said, halfway through my PhD, I changed my focuses, and then in my postdoc, I switched to deep learning. And now as a professor, I'm like, I don't have time to learn the next big thing. Like, I just have to sort of like coast on the knowledge that I've already gained. I don't have time to learn anything. But I totally agree with the larger sentiment that it's just, how do you know? And is it worthwhile even learning something if then 2 years later, the next hot thing's already changed?
And maybe a question to end on then is, if you were a PhD student today, so just starting off from scratch, what would you do? What would your bet be?
Yeah. Okay. So obviously, I think machine learning has a few more years in it, but I've actually lately been getting excited by programming languages, and in my spare time, trying to read about like dependent type theory and some of the new languages that are coming out, like Idris and Agda. I don't know if you guys have heard of these things.
No.
Yeah, they're basically saying, what if we made the type system Turing complete? What if we allowed undecidable types that could depend on each other in all sorts of interesting ways? Then the sort of line between programming and verification gets blurred. I think there's tons of interesting stuff in this space, and some of it is even making it back into more mainstream programming languages, like very, very slowly. But to be honest, I'm saying that more because I think there's a lot of cool stuff there, and less because I think there's going to be lots of jobs in that area.
So pretty much machine learning then. Is that fair to say? If you're in it just for the jobs?
If I was going to go, yeah, just like everyone else, I would join the gold rush to learn machine learning. I mean, one thing I'll say is I think it feels really bad to join a gold rush, right? But for the past 5 years, I've been talking to like friends of mine who used to do physics or something and then got into machine learning, saying, "Oh man, I totally missed the gold rush. Like, everyone here has been around forever. I'm just the new guy." And now 5 years later, they're like the old salts, right? I mean, I've only been in this field for like 10 years, right? It's a bizarrely new field, bizarrely accessible. Tools are getting nicer to use. So obviously, who knows how long it'll be worthwhile to go into the gold rush. Yeah, that's pretty weak advice. Join the gold rush. But I think there's still
gold to be found.
There's still gold to be out. There's still jobs to be had. There's a lot of companies who really want to hire someone who can build a bespoke model for their problem. And I think there's just like tens of thousands of jobs like that, like in Canada, for instance. And I think there's going to be at least 5 or 10 years before that sort of work becomes seriously automatable.
All right. 5 or 10 whole years.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for making the time for this chat. I know you're really busy, so this is especially appreciated.
But it's been an absolute pleasure being on this podcast and talking to you guys. Yeah.